Forget everything you thought you knew about the great conqueror Hernán Cortés, the image of a fearless conquistador driven by faith and a thirst for gold, so kindly painted for us by historians. Forget divine providence and civilizational superiority. Because before you stands not merely a soldier, not just an adventurer. Before you is the first genius of systemic destruction in human history, an architect of chaos who, with not a penny to his name, no army, and not even a clear order, managed to plunge an entire civilization into an abyss. And he did so not by force of steel, but by a masterful dance on the strings of others' fears, ambitions, and delusions. Imagine a mere handful of a few hundred ragged men, landing on a foreign continent, without provisions, without reinforcements, surrounded by millions of hostile warriors. Any normal person would have immediately signed their own death warrant. Cortés, however, not only survived, he rewrote the rules of the game. He did not conquer. He subverted. He did not fight. He manipulated. He did not build. He exploded from within. His true weapon was not the arquebus or the sword, but a profound, almost diabolical understanding of human psychology. He saw not just people, but their weaknesses, their prejudices, their hidden desires. And he knew how to push each of these buttons to trigger a chain reaction of self-destruction, all while cloaking it under a facade of piety and higher purposes. This was not war. It was a spectacle. A grand, bloody drama where Cortés was simultaneously director, screenwriter, and lead actor. He turned fear into a weapon, diplomacy into poison, and faith into a tool of subjugation. And most terrifyingly, he did this not out of pure malice, but with cold, calculated pragmatism. He was not just a man who wanted gold. He was a man who understood how the world worked and was willing to overturn it for his goal. But who was this phenomenon? Where did this unprecedented blend of cold calculation, boundless ambition, and absolute ruthlessness come from? What shaped a mind capable not just of conquering, but of reshaping entire worlds? We have already spoken of Cortés as, if you will, the first genius of systemic destruction, an architect of chaos who did not merely conquer, but deconstructed civilizations. But from where does such a person emerge? What forms a personality capable of dismantling foreign worlds with such cold, almost clinical efficiency? To understand the monster, one must look into the cradle, and sometimes into the crypt where his childhood dreams are. Buried. Hernán Cortés was born in 1485, in Extremadura, a region that was then less Spain and more a forge of conquistadors. It was a land of harsh customs, weather-beaten by the winds of the Reconquista, where notions of honor, duty, and just war were deeply woven into the fabric of daily life, yet coexisted with extreme poverty and a lack of prospects for most. His family, impoverished hidalgos, possessed only a resonant name, not land or wealth. Imagine, a noble lineage that granted the right to arrogance but not to dinner. This is a classic recipe for ambition bordering on obsession. If you cannot be king by birth, you must become one by deed. Otherwise, oblivion, and for a man with such a name, that was worse than death. Cortés's childhood, according to the scant surviving records, was no idyll. He was a sickly child, which perhaps hardened his will, teaching him to survive where others broke. Then, a brief but telling episode of education in Salamanca. Just 2 years of jurisprudence. Why so little? Perhaps academic routine quickly bored his restless mind. Perhaps he understood that true power lay not in the letter of the law, but in its violation, in the ability to rewrite it to suit his own ends. He was not a bookworm, but he was certainly a predator who learned to read not texts, but people. He did not merely grasp Latin. He mastered rhetoric, the art of persuasion, which would later become his primary weapon. And of course, he absorbed the dogmas of Catholicism, which, as we shall see, he used with virtuosic cynicism to justify the most heinous acts. The pivotal moment, the point of no return, was his decision to sail for the New World. This was not a romantic impulse. Spain in the late 15th and early 16th centuries was overflowing with men like him, young, ambitious, possessing nothing but a hunger for glory and gold. The New World was not just an opportunity. It was the only way out of the vicious cycle of poverty and insignificance. He arrived in Hispaniola in 1504, young, still ambitious, but not yet the Cortés we know. His first years were years of apprenticeship. He participated in early expeditions, observed other conquistadors, learning from their mistakes and successes. He saw how fear and greed drove people, how easily empires built on ancient beliefs shattered, and how subtly human psychology could be manipulated. It was then, in this ruthless school of survival, far from the shackles of old Europe, that his character was finally forged. He understood that on this new land, rules were not written, and those that existed were only there to be broken. His youthful ailments, his noble but impoverished family, his brief but purposeful education, all converged, creating a man who did not merely want to conquer. He had to. It became his existential necessity, a way to prove to the world, and perhaps to himself, that he was not just a survivor, but the chosen one. This internal resolve, this uncompromising determination and willingness to step over anyone, using any means, from hypocrisy to ruthless slaughter, is what distinguished him from thousands of other adventurers. He was not just seeking gold, he sought confirmation of his exceptionalism, his destiny, and he was willing to pay any price to realize it. It was this man, with such a psychological foundation, forged in the crucible of despair and ambition, who prepared for his greatest enterprise. He arrived in the New World not just for gold, but for confirmation of his exceptionalism, to prove that he was something more than just another commoner cast upon the shores of fate. His years of apprenticeship in Hispaniola and Cuba were merely a prelude, that repulsive but necessary internship in the art of systemic destruction, where Cortés observed, absorbed, and sharpened his ruthless gaze on human weaknesses and how to exploit them. And so, when his ship, its mass groaning under the weight of ambition, finally reached the shores of what would become Mexico, he was ready. Ready not just to conquer, but to decompose. Ready not just to take, but to reshape reality, exploiting any crack in the foundation of a foreign civilization. We will not discuss how he landed, how he exchanged trinkets for rumors of untold riches. That is boring. We are interested in the anatomy of the conqueror at the zenith of his diabolical genius, when he was no longer merely an adventurer, but an architect of chaos, consciously and masterfully pulling the strings. The first act of this bloody opera was not merely burning the ships, as romantics so grandiosely proclaim. It was far more sophisticated, far more cynical. Imagine the hot, humid air of Veracruz. Soldiers, exhausted by the journey, doubting, frightened by rumors of multi-thousand Aztec armies awaiting them deep within the continent. Among them, a whisper, a rising murmur. What if we go back? What if this is madness? Cortés, that pale but steely man, sees this. He smells fear, and he knows what to do with it. Scene 1. Farewell to Illusions, or how Cortés drowned the hope of retreat. Plan. Eliminate the very possibility of escape. Not just forbid it, but physically destroy the paths of retreat. No, what if? Only forward or death. This was not an act of bravery. It was an act of absolute control, psychological terror directed at his own army. Cortés understood that a man deprived of choice becomes an instrument. Execution. He did not burn the ships. That would be too theatrical and impractical. He ordered them dismantled. Sails, rigging, tackle, rudders, masts, all removed. Everything valuable that could be used on land was salvaged. And then, the hulls were scuttled or smashed against the shore. The official version for the masses: the ships were unsuitable, leaky, dangerous. We couldn't risk lives returning on such vessels. But the true meaning was clear to everyone. There was no turning back. You would either die here or become immeasurably rich. There was no choice. Either victory or carrion for vultures. Unexpected twist. For some, it was a shock. For others, a catharsis. Some grumbled, but most cornered, felt a strange liberation, as if a heavy burden of doubt had fallen from their shoulders. Now every blade, every step, every breath was directed toward a single goal. The psychological effect was astonishing. Despair transformed into reckless resolve. Cortés did not merely destroy the fleet, he destroyed the mental possibility of retreat. He locked them in a golden cage, where the only way out was over mountains of corpses. Consequences. This action cemented his power over the men. From now on, he was not just a captain, but the demiurge of their fate. Every soldier became a hostage to his vision, his ambition. No one could betray him without betraying themselves and their comrades. It was a perfect trap, from which there was no exit but forward, into the very heart of the Aztec Empire, which did not yet know that what was approaching it was not merely an army, but a virus. Cortés's virus spread rapidly. He did not just advance. He sowed chaos, exploiting ancient grievances and centuries-old animosities among the indigenous tribes. He was a master of dehumanization, capable of convincing one group of barbarians to destroy another, only to subjugate the first later. And so, on the way to Tenochtitlan, lay the city of Cholula, a sacred center, once an ally of the Aztecs. Here, Cortés decided to teach the world, and primarily the Aztecs themselves, a lesson that would be written in blood. Scene 2. The bloody lesson of Cholula, or how terror becomes a tool of diplomacy. Plan. Destroy the myth of impregnability and sacredness, sow terror, demonstrate absolute ruthlessness, and, most importantly, strengthen the alliance with the Tlaxcalans, giving them an opportunity to take revenge on long-standing enemies. This was pure, unadulterated geopolitics, steeped in blood and deceit. Execution. Cortés entered Cholula with feigned peacefulness, but with a pre-prepared narrative. His indigenous translator, Malinche, a woman whose role in this drama merits a separate investigation, discovered a conspiracy. Allegedly, the Cholulans were planning an attack to destroy the Spaniards and their Tlaxcalan allies. Proof? What proof? A word, uttered at the right moment, was enough to ignite the flames of paranoia. The Spaniards summoned the Cholulan nobility to the main square, ostensibly for a farewell. And when the square was filled with unarmed chiefs, priests, elders, Cortés gave the signal. Spanish soldiers and thousands of Tlaxcalan allies descended upon the unsuspecting citizens. It was not a battle, but a massacre. Thousands of people were killed within hours. Temples burned, streets turned into rivers of blood. Unexpected twist. The terror Cortés intended to sow exceeded all expectations. News of Cholula spread with the speed of a prairie fire, preceding the Spaniards by hundreds of miles. But it was not just news of cruelty, but of incomprehensible, godlike cruelty. Many cities on the way to Tenochtitlan, hearing of Cholula, simply opened their gates and offered gifts, preferring humiliation to annihilation. Cortés, without realizing it, transformed himself into a living embodiment of the apocalypse for these peoples. He became not just a conqueror, but a harbinger of the end of the world. Consequences. Cholula became Cortés's calling card. It was his manifesto. We didn't just come. We came to overturn your world, and we will stop at nothing. This act of terror cemented his alliance with the Tlaxcalans, who were now bound by blood and forever cut off from their former overlords. For Montezuma, the supreme ruler of the Aztecs, this was the first real blow that made him doubt his divine protection. The fear sown in Cholula became the invisible army that paved Cortés's way directly into the heart of the empire. And so he stood at the gates of Tenochtitlan, a city built on a lake, shining like a precious gem, the jewel of Mesoamerica. A city that was both a marvel of engineering and a ticking time bomb. Cortés did not take it by storm. He entered it as a virus penetrates an organism, to decompose it from within. Scene 3. Hospitality and the Gilded Cage, or how Cortés imprisoned a god. Plan. Enter the city peacefully, assess its strengths and weaknesses, study the enemy in his own home, and then decapitate the serpent by capturing Montezuma to control the empire through his figure. This was a Trojan horse game, but the horse was Spanish, and the devil himself sat inside. Execution. The meeting of Cortés and Montezuma is one of the greatest moments of manipulation in history. Montezuma, surrounded by grandeur, but poisoned by ancient prophecies and rumors of gods from the east, met Cortés with deference. He offered him gold, jewels, and honorable lodging. Cortés accepted all of this with cold courtesy, but his eyes were already scanning the palace, the city, the people. A few days later, under the pretext of protection from possible attacks, Cortés, with a small group of his men, entered Montezuma's chambers. He did not openly threaten. He simply convinced the emperor that for his own safety and for the good of his people, he should move to the Spanish quarters, and that he should rule under their supervision. This was not imprisonment, but hospitality from which there was no escape. Unexpected twist. Montezuma, the supreme ruler of an empire whose word was law for millions, surrendered with surprising ease. For centuries, his people had lived under his absolute power, and now their emperor, their god, became a puppet in the hands of a handful of strangers. His passivity, his belief in prophecies, his inability to understand the true nature of these gods, all played into Cortés's hands. But as long as Montezuma remained in Spanish hands, his people, though they grumbled, dared not openly rebel. They were in a stupor, paralyzed by disbelief and fear. Consequences. Cortés got what he wanted: control over the empire through its nominal leader. He forced Montezuma to declare himself a vassal of the Spanish king, to collect tribute in gold, and even allowed the Spaniards to desecrate sacred temples. This was the peak of his power, but also the beginning of the end for the Aztecs. Every day Montezuma spent in the gilded cage brought the inevitable explosion closer. The people, seeing the humiliation of their ruler, began to awaken from their stupor. The Spaniards had pulled the strings for too long, not understanding that the puppet could at any moment sever them and bring the entire stage crashing down. And in this complex game, where every move could be fatal, new players emerged, new forces, new shadows that began to gather over the conqueror. Some were unexpected allies, others mortal enemies, but all were part of the grand, bloody spectacle that Cortés himself had staged. And their appearance, their motives, their secret connections, that is what we will begin to dissect next. Cortés was not a lone wolf, roaming the wilds of the New World with only a sword and boundless ambition. He was merely the tip of the iceberg, the spearhead of unseen but powerful hands. His feats are not just the story of one man, they are a symphony of destruction, performed by an entire orchestra of interested parties. And if you still believe the fairy tale of the heroic lone conquistador, prepare for an anatomy of true power, where behind every great conqueror stands an entire network of patrons, rivals, and puppets. Who, then, was pulling the strings? Of course, primarily the Spanish crown, hungry for gold and new lands. But not only them. Imagine the shadow investors, moneylenders, aristocrats, who invested in this venture, counting on fabulous profits. Every ton of gold, every captured city. That was not only Cortés's triumph, but also a fat check for those sitting in cozy offices in Seville or Madrid, sipping wine and watching stock market reports. They were not merely patrons, they were accomplices, recipients of dividends from the bloody harvest. And while Cortés risked his head, they risked only capital, knowing that in case of failure, they could always disavow the overreaching adventurer, and in case of success, claim the credit and even attribute the achievements to themselves. But let's return to the direct participants in this drama. If Cortés was the brain and the fist, he also had a voice, eyes, and ears. And that voice was Malinche. Not merely a translator, gentlemen. This is a woman whose biography merits a separate spin-off, full of intrigue, betrayals, and survival. Sold into slavery, she possessed not only linguistic genius, but also a phenomenal political acumen. She understood the dynamics of indigenous tribes, their feuds, their weaknesses. It was she who whispered to Cortés about internal dissensions, about who hated whom, who envied whom. Her information was not just a translation of words, it was a translation of cultural codes, social connections, mental maps. She was his strategic analyst, his spy, his psychologist, his shadow. Without Malinche, Cortés would have been blind and deaf, wandering in a foreign land. She was his greatest asset, his secret weapon, capable of turning rumors into deadly strategies, as happened in Cholula, where her warnings became the pretext for the bloody massacre that solidified his alliance with the Tlaxcalans. And the Tlaxcalans? Oh, they were not naive savages, enchanted by bearded strangers. They were pragmatists, living in the shadow of the Aztec Empire, which they hated with fierce intensity. For them, Cortés was not a deity, but an instrument, a sword with which to sever the hated chains of tribute and humiliation. They saw the Spaniards not as saviors, but as temporary allies in a war they had waged for decades. and they were willing to pay a high price, just to overthrow Montezuma. Their thousands of warriors, their knowledge of the terrain, their resources, all were an integral part of the conquest machine. This was not mere assistance. It was a full-fledged military pact, based on shared hatred and mutual benefit. History does not tolerate simple narratives, and Cortés's alliance with the Tlaxcalans is a clear testament to that. It was a deal, not a friendship, a deal written in blood and sealed by a shared thirst for vengeance. But not everyone was willing to dance to Cortés's tune. Behind his back, like a shadow, loomed Diego Velázquez, the governor of Cuba, whose authority and power Cortés had so brazenly trampled. For Velázquez, Cortés was not just a rebel, but a personal affront, a challenge to his authority, a threat to his income. He could not forgive Cortés either for his unauthorized departure or for declaring himself independent of Cuba. Velázquez, this bureaucrat and schemer, was determined to put the insubordinate subordinate back in his place. He equipped an entire expedition under the command of Pánfilo de Narváez to arrest Cortés and bring him in chains to Cuba. This was not just a conflict between two men. It was a clash between institutional power and audacious, unchecked ambition. A clash that could have changed the course of history, were it not for Cortés's genius in manipulating people and circumstances, and of course, Montezuma, the supreme ruler, whose tragic image still sparks debate. Was he a naive fatalist, paralyzed by prophecies, or a calculating politician, attempting to buy time and avoid bloodshed? Most likely both. His passivity, his belief that Cortés was Quetzalcoatl, returned from exile, proved fatal for his empire. He allowed Cortés to enter Tenochtitlan. He allowed himself to be captured. He agreed to rule under Spanish supervision, transforming himself from emperor to puppet. This was a humiliation that his subjects could not bear. His attempts to appease the Spaniards, his calls for submission, were perceived as betrayal. It was this humiliation, this loss of face by the supreme ruler, that became the spark that ignited the flame of rebellion. Montezuma, without knowing it, prepared the ground for his own downfall and the fall of his empire. He was a figure whose weaknesses Cortés exploited masterfully, turning faith into a weapon and authority into a straitjacket for an entire people. But even the strongest straitjacket eventually breaks when a people's patience runs out. The curtain was falling. But not to the thunder of cannons and the cries of dying Aztecs, no. The finale for the architect of chaos was far more sophisticated, far more Spanish. It was not a thriller with chases through jungles, but a slowly tightening noose of lawsuits, court intrigues, and relentless bureaucracy. Who, if not Cortés, would know that the most terrible battle is not on the field, but at tables piled with parchments and royal decrees? His fall was not a sudden collapse, but a creeping erosion. The crown, which so eagerly used his bloody fruits, never trusted this upstart. Too much power, too much gold, too much autonomy. Diego Velázquez, the governor of Cuba, whose ambitions Cortés had once cynically trampled, was merely the first in a long line of those who craved his blood, or at least his share. But Cortés's true executioners were far more faceless and powerful, the envy of aristocrats, the king's fear of his potential autonomy, and of course, the endless denunciations from those he had bypassed, robbed, or humiliated. He was betrayed, not by a dagger in the back, but by ink on paper. Every step he took, every peso he gained, every indigenous life he ground in the millstones of his empire, was recorded and sent to Seville, then to Madrid. Denunciations of cruelty, extravagance, abuse of power, this was his hunt. He was tracked not by footprints in the forest, but by account books, by the complaints of monks, by the whispers of envious courtiers. His final mistakes? He never understood that the game had changed. He was a genius of war and intrigue in a wild land, but an utterly inept player in the suffocating halls of European politics. He continued to think in terms of conquest, while obedience and loyalty were demanded of him. He forgot that even the sharpest sword eventually dulls against a bureaucratic wall. The scenes of his inglorious end unfolded not on majestic pyramids, but in dusty lawyers' offices, and at receptions where he, once the all-powerful Marquis of the Valley of Oaxaca, was treated as an annoying nuisance. He shuttled between Spain and the New World, trying to reclaim his titles, his lands, his reputation. He squandered most of his immense wealth on endless litigations, trying to prove his loyalty to a crown that merely nodded coldly, taking more and giving less. In 1547, exhausted, ill, burdened by debt, Hernán Cortés died in Castilleja de la Cuesta, near Seville. Not in golden palaces, not to thunderous fanfares, but in relative obscurity, at an inn, far from his conquests. Imagine this scene: the aging, once great conqueror, lying on his deathbed. In his eyes there is neither the gleam of triumph nor the horror of defeat, only weariness and perhaps a bitter realization. What did he think in his last moments? Perhaps of the gold that never brought him true peace. Of Montezuma, whose tragic fate, paradoxically, was not so different from his own, both victims of another's will. Perhaps he cursed the king who took everything from him but the ghost of glory. Or, more likely for such a cynic, he simply calculated the remnants of his lands and titles, trying to understand what had gone wrong in this grand, bloody, and ultimately meaningless game. His empire was built on sand, and now its sand crumbled, burying him beneath it. But even in this inglorious end, his methods, his anatomy of a conqueror, did not disappear. They merely transformed, taking on new forms and faces. Why do we need Cortés today? What on earth can a dead conquistador, buried under layers of centuries of dust and romanticized myths, offer us? This. Hernán Cortés is not just a historical figure. He is, quite simply, a textbook on the anatomy of systemic destruction, on the psychology of mass manipulation, and on how one man, armed only with boundless cynicism and strategic genius, can bring an entire civilization to its knees without overwhelming numerical superiority. His methods were not a frontal assault, but a slow, elegant strangulation, based on the subtlest understanding of human fears, ambitions, and, most terrifyingly, hopes. Look around. Can you not see his shadow in every charismatic politician building a career on societal division, skillfully pitting one group against another, promising salvation from bait? Fabricated threats? Don't you recognize his signature in the methods of modern fraudsters, who promise easy riches or spiritual enlightenment, draining you of everything by playing on your greed or desperation? Haven't you encountered adventurers who, like Cortés, burn their ships, old connections, reputation, moral principles, to force themselves and their followers to advance relentlessly toward some phantom victory that, in reality, turns out to be only their personal triumph built on the destruction of others? Cortés was a master of controlled chaos. He didn't just destroy. He reshaped reality in people's minds. He transformed fear into a resource, internal conflicts into a weapon, and ancient prophecies into a tool for legitimizing power. These tricks haven't disappeared today. They've merely taken on new, more sophisticated forms: media manipulation, information warfare, the canceling of dissenters, the creation of personality cults. The essence remains the same. Sow doubt, ignite hatred, offer oneself as the sole salvation, and then profit from the fruits of others' desperation. The main lesson from Cortés isn't that history repeats itself. That's a truism. The lesson is that human nature remains remarkably predictable and vulnerable. We are still ready to believe in fantasies if they promise security or gain. We still fear the unknown and prefer to follow someone who confidently points the way, even if it leads to ruin. We are still prone to self-deception when confronted with something that doesn't fit our worldview, much like Montezuma, paralyzed by prophecies. Hernán Cortés did not defeat the Aztecs by force of arms. He conquered their minds. He used their faith, internal divisions, fears, and hopes against them. He showed that the most destructive force is not an army, but an idea that corrodes from within. And that idea is that one can trust someone who promises mountains of gold while simultaneously destroying everything built before them. So then, if Cortés was an architect of chaos, who are we? Are we the ones who allow these architects to erect their bloody palaces on the ruins of our trust, our values, our stability? Who are we if after 500 years, we still fall for the same, essentially primitive, yet devilishly effective tricks? And, most unpleasantly, are we truly incapable of learning this lesson? Are we doomed to forever await our Quetzalcoatl from the West, who comes not to save but to plunder, exploiting our naivety and our own internal divisions? And this is just one side of the coin. For behind every Cortés there is always an entire system that spawned him, funded him, and ultimately devoured him. a system that is itself part of this endless dance of power and avarice.